present on Adventism and fundamentalism. His final installment, he calls it, in his series on Adventism and fundamentalism. So looking forward to that tonight, tomorrow morning, and then tomorrow morning we'll have Sabbath school and church, and then in the afternoon we'll wrap it up. So really looking forward to that. I first met Michael in 2005. I was an intern at the Adventist headquarters, and as an intern, I just rented a room from somebody there in the area, and he turned out to be a friend of Michael's, as many people are, and so he's like, "Oh, Steve, a friend of mine's coming into town for meetings at the GC, and he'll stay with us." Oh, cool, fine, great. And so it turns out it's Michael Campbell, and so that's how I first met him, and that was my first introduction to how much fun it can be to talk Adventist history. And so Michael's telling me all sorts of things that I didn't know, and it was a lot of fun. We had a great time talking Adventist history. And this is one of the things I really appreciate, is that Michael makes this stuff, it's fun. It genuinely is fun. And I've appreciated many, many good conversations with Michael on Adventist history, and even today, you can dive real deep with Michael on the deep issues, and you can also just talk about the fun ones at times. Today, we discussed Adventism and pie, the early Adventists and pie, and we had a brief conversation on it, including Ellen White's favorite pie. And so we went over that. So really a lot of good things, and I appreciate that. But I also appreciate that Michael has a very positive attitude about these things, right? The wise Solomon writes that in the reading of many books there's weariness. And you can go down that road with history, right? But Michael has a very positive and uplifting way of looking at Adventist history, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate his heart for ministry and all of this as well. In fact, I remember him having a very genuine and deep conversation with my roommate and having a very heartfelt prayer with him. And I noted that, and I still remember that to this day. So really, really grateful to have Michael with us here this weekend. And so I'll open with prayer. Then we'll turn it over to you. Lord, thank you so much for this Sabbath and this special weekend. And we thank you for the shoulders that we stand on here in Adventism. And we're just very grateful to have this time to study and to learn and to grow. Thank you for Michael Campbell and his work in helping us understand where we come from, and by that, where we're going. And we love you, and thank you for loving us first. We pray in your name. Amen.
I was wondering if I had to, sometimes as a historian you can get forgetful, so I wanted to make sure I was thinking the right person, so. Good evening. Glad to be here with you. In case you're wondering, Ellen White's favorite pie was lemon pie. So if you ever had Ellen White over for your home on Sabbath afternoon, you know which pie to make. So there you go. And or maybe in her memory, if you want to have such a pie, here we go. Just a minute. This evening, I'm just so delighted to be here with you guys. And is that working out okay? Yeah, okay, good. All right, good evening. I'm not distracted now by the technology, but I'm really happy to be here. I think it was 2 years ago, roughly, I don't know, and had such a good time that I had to come back. And when I travel, there's a lot of fun places that you can go and travel, and usually you're really busy and stuff like that. It was funny, I was at Andrews University yesterday. My daughter's a freshman, so I suddenly started accepting a few more speaking appointments to Andrews University, and tried not to embarrass her. I was speaking for a campus event yesterday, so she actually came, so that was very sweet, and took her out with some of her friends and so on. And then I was at the airport this morning, and one of my beloved seminary professors, Dr. Kidder, was sitting in the seat next to me in the airplane. Who knew? And so we're comparing frequent flyer miles because we both have traveled a fair amount in our lives here on this planet. And so we were comparing stories. And I asked him where he's going, and he asked me where I was going. He said, I think I like where you're going, because he said that's got to be one of the most beautiful places in Coeur d'Alene, that with the lake or the different lakes around. He said that is such a beautiful place. So you guys live truly in a wonder of God's creation. So it's good to be here. I try not to tell my family how beautiful this place is, lest I make them too jealous. But anyways, good to be here. Usually when I travel, I'll rent a car, but I know when I'm in good hands of Ashley and Steve that I'm in good hands and well taken care of. And so I just have had such a delightful time already. But tonight is an interesting topic. We're beginning a series. And I've been doing a lot of work the last few years. Now, there's maybe weariness in reading books. It didn't say any weariness in writing books. And so I'm trying to see if I can outpublish my advisor and good friend George Knight. But he just won't stop writing books. So I feel like I'm just keeping pace or whatever. But I love writing books and doing research. And tonight is, you guys are like guinea pigs, okay? I'm just going to be very vulnerable with you here, that I'm presenting a little bit on the Scopes trial and creation and some of those debates through the 1920s, continuing my series on Adventism and fundamentalism. Now, if you're not familiar with that, I'll try to unpack that and define that a little bit better for you so it's not quite so just nebulous, but just to say that this is my first time presenting this particular presentation. So I'm sharing some research, and I've spent literally hundreds and hundreds of hours doing the research for it. So for me, it's a little bit of a challenge. How do you pack all of that information in? And we only have 2 hours tonight, Ashley? Yeah, okay. I saw that face. So, no, don't worry. Don't get scared. I'll rein it in. Don't worry. But I do want to succinctly try to bring a lot of research together. And if there's enough time, maybe we'll even have a little time for, is it okay if we do a couple Q&A at the very end? Okay. And that's good. That's helpful for me to know, because after I get done presenting, and those of you that are familiar with some of my work, at least the 1919, 1922, that I've been doing a lot of work on how do we understand inspired writings, the interpretation of those writings. And over a century ago, that there was a lot of questions of how do you, in a healthy and a balanced way, interpret sacred writings. And we're talking in an Adventist context, not only about the Bible, which is absolutely vital that we understand those sacred writings and how to interpret them, but that also by extension also applies to Ellen White's writings. And so there's some of these parallel kinds of questions that do relate to one another. And so part of what I'm presenting tonight, and then of course I'll be spending more time tomorrow on some other topics that are also germane but going a little bit different direction. I'm looking at continuing this saga of Adventism and fundamentalism. And so I've done a lot of work on the 1920s. That's my area of expertise. And so part of that drama in the 1920s is a huge debate about how do we understand creation? What does this mean for Adventism, right? So you ready to dive in with me? Shall we do it? All right. Hey, let me pray one more time. I know Steve prayed, but I just want to pray one more time, and then we'll dive into our topic. Father God, thank you for the privilege to be here this evening as part of this lecture series, as part of here in this church. And so in this sacred space, as we spend time reflecting about our Adventist past and some of the challenges, some of the high points along the way, that we can learn and grow and benefit from those things. So bless my lips in this research. Help me to be concise tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. The topic of creation is a vital one to Adventism. I mentioned I like to fly a lot, and so when I travel, that sometimes I usually put my noise-canceling headphones on right away, and I get in the zone, I start reading, and I start writing or whatever. And not long ago, I was sitting next to an individual, and they're the CFO a major corporation that you would recognize. And so right away, I was just about to put my headphones on, and they said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a pastor and historian." I've never met someone that's a pastor and a historian before. So, and I said, what do you do, And so she explained and then asked me again, what does a pastor and historian do? Well, so I started explaining, what church are you a part of? I said, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. And then she said, I've never heard of you before, your church before. And I said, well, I'm so glad that I can tell you about a faith that's very important to me personally. And so the next 2-3 hours of our flight, as we're going across the country, we suddenly are having this very engrossed spiritual conversation. She's telling me about her own walk with God and different questions. And then finally she looks at me and says, Sabbath, seventh-day Sabbath, what is that? And I said, well, let me tell you that what we do is, the Sabbath is special time for us, sacred time that we worship on Saturdays. That might look a little bit different for us, but even more important than that is when we have the seventh-day Sabbath, when we keep the Sabbath, that it's time to have meaningful, it's a spiritual time to work on our relationship with God and to have meaningful relationships with our family and our community around us. And so she said, well, how do you keep the Sabbath? And I said, well, for me, I try to turn off my social media and anything that's really distract me. And then I'm trying to explain what a blessing this was in our family to just have time to really connect, right? And then she just looked at me and said, wow, I need the Sabbath. In fact, she said, do you think I could bring my husband next time I fly out to DC for a meeting? Could we go to church with you? Yeah, just random stranger on the plane, and by the time we land, she's wanting to go to church with us. By the way, one more interesting question. She said, I want to know, does your church care about the environment? I said, it's funny you should ask, because we believe in the Sabbath. We believe in God's creation, which means that if God created it, it has meaning and value, and God placed us as stewards to take care of God's creation, and ultimately, because of sin, it's going to be destroyed. But until then, we are to learn how and are these stewards to care for God's creation. And did you know that our church, this is what I do for a living, is I do research and statistics and stuff like that for the North American division. I said, the research shows that our church is one of the most committed denominations to creation care. And she said, wow, a church that has the Sabbath and cares about creation, this is an amazing church. I've been looking for you. And so this is a joy to me to think about that something that we sometimes, if I dare say, may even take these things for granted, that there's people out there yearning for these kinds of things, that if we just explained it in a way that they could understand, could say, you know what, this is profoundly relevant for the world in which we live. Anyways, I want to begin here with Joseph Bates, because Joseph Bates is the apostle of the Sabbath, right? He's the one that's going across the bridge, and you guys came with us and saw what was left of the bridge. Steve and Ashley came on one of our heritage tours. I might need that water. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Got something in my throat. Sorry about that. And anyway, so the bridge. And so Joseph Bates is crossing the bridge. He had just discovered the Sabbath truth. And his friend James Madison Monroe Hall shouts out to him, "What's the news?" We would say, "What's up?" And he shouts back to him, "The news is that the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord our God." The Sabbath is what's up. It's awesome. It's good news. It's something about a relationship with God. And God's people at the end of time are going to be so committed and in love with Jesus. They just want to make sure they honor that commitment in every way that they can, because the Sabbath is such a beautiful truth. And that means also that through the 19th century, that our pioneers were also very committed and concerned about how we understood creation, because the Sabbath began at creation. And so this is a part of what God has entrusted to us as a legacy that we are to keep the Sabbath because it's a blessing to us. And of course, the Sabbath will be challenged. Creation, more specifically, I should say, will be challenged with Charles Darwin, who writes the famous book, The Origin of Species. This is not a surprise, I'm sure, to any of you in any history curriculum. This is going to be standard lore of how the development of some of the concepts, and of course, he didn't all by himself. There were others after him, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar, or this is common territory that you can easily look up. But it is not a surprise that when Charles Darwin and some of the teachings of natural selection and what later becomes known as evolution, that these will be concepts that will challenge Christians. And there's a basic fundamental premise that takes place that there are different kinds of responses, different kinds of groups. There will be those who, and by the way, this is true of the church in all times and places in Christian history. There are those who will be more accommodating versus those who will be more resistant to change. And so is change good or is it bad? And I would suggest to you tonight, it's always a little bit of both, isn't it? I mean, if we don't have growth and change, we die. And so even our cells are constantly replicating and so on. So we see within Scripture that there are these constants, the ebb and flow, which suggests that sometimes there's a little bit of complexity. Not everything is clear. And so, and for most Christians in the 19th century, there will be some groups that will begin to take some of these ideas and say, well, science is telling us this. Do we need to change and update our beliefs and our understanding of creation? Or do we resist that and see that as some kind of threat, something antithetical to the gospel? Well, I don't think you're going to be surprised by this. Adventist historian Gary Land observes that Darwinism became the dominant intellectual influence in postbellum America. So that's after the Civil War, specifically in the 1870s and afterwards. And another famous philosopher, historical theologian, you probably recognize his name, Alistair McGrath, also observes or notes how Darwin emphasized the importance of prediction, but even he himself left religious beliefs as a private matter. So from the more science world, he's trying to, he was the son of a preacher, so he was trying to separate the science from the religion, from having some kind of competition from each other. Would they be in conflict with one another? And this will become the beginning, and certainly it wasn't really the beginning. I mean, you can even trace it before this, but this is where it becomes pitch heated, I guess you should say, of this challenge between science and religion. Now, the late 19th century, and a friend of mine, Matthew Avery Sutton, he actually teaches here at the University of Washington, not too far from here, next state over, and he wrote a very significant book titled American Apocalypse. And he argues that the premillennialists all agreed that Germany's liberal theology and embrace of Darwinism and its theories caused a conflagration. Well, that's just a fancy word, a firestorm. So you see conservatives feeling what? Besieged, under threat. And this will contribute to the unfolding of fundamentalism. I'll come back to this. And where does Seventh-day Adventists fit within this picture? Well, I think it would be no surprise to anyone here that our pioneers of our church found Darwin's theory of evolution to be, well, they didn't mince their words, disguised infidelity, right? I'm not going to read this article for you, but it's a article by one of our pioneers that's reflecting on having gone to a meeting and being able to hear a famous professor and share their views and just kind of the shock of what this would mean. If humans weren't really created but simply evolved over time, not only did God not create them, but then how do you explain sin? How do you explain the whole concept of salvation? And so this is part of the challenge that we see. George Amidon, another one of these early pioneers. I'm just giving a couple of quick examples here this evening because You could do a whole presentation tonight just on Adventist responses, and other people have. These are just some of the earliest and most colorful ones that I have found from, again, 1875. That's quite in line with Matthew Avery Sutton talking about that's when this is becoming a huge issue within American religion at that time, this agitation, this conflagration, right? And here he is, also the same thing, the new scriptures, and he's talking again about some of these philosophers of Huxley and Spencer and Darwin, right? So, and how this threatens the quote-unquote Mosaic account of creation. Is the account of creation in the Bible actually reliable, or is it not? Now, this raises or poses a very significant question, because how do we interpret the Bible? How do we understand the Bible? What are the claims we make for the Bible? Because if we're not careful, we can sometimes claim more from the Bible than what the Bible actually says. I'll come back to that point a little bit later here this evening, but I want you to think about that, ponder that for just a moment. Now, I want to come back to this idea of fundamentalism, or as James Dunn puts it in his book, fundamentalisms, because there are a lot of different varieties of fundamentalism, and how we understand and how we use words matters. In fact, I have some friends, they even have suggested to me, well, Michael, I don't like the word fundamentalism. Maybe I should just get rid of it and not use it anymore, because, there are Islamic extremists that are fundamentalists, that are suicide bombers or something like that. And if you say that there are Christians or perhaps even Adventists who are fundamentalists, then you're associating those with maybe something else that sounds very dramatic and so on. And I realized that today, in today's world, that sometimes using words can be very difficult, because people can co-opt those words. But I'm going to suggest to you that I think the word actually is useful for several reasons, but most important of which is that it's a historical term and was used as a historical movement in which people used that word to describe themselves. In fact, one historian, just last weekend, I was hanging out with a group of historians, totally nerding out for like 4 days. You're not going to believe this, but this is what historians do every once in a while, every 3 years, in fact. All the Adventist historians get together and we give papers back and forth, and we critique each other's papers. And we did it at Rosario Beach, not on the other side of the state of Washington. And we were just having so much fun. Yeah. And so, and I, in fact, I just wrote another book, and so I had sent the book manuscript out. A historian friend of mine, he just shredded it, and other people were like, well, I said, that was so enjoyable. I loved it, because, it just meant so much that he read the book and gave me all this great feedback and so on. So this is what historians love to do. We critique each other, and so and by the way, I did it to his book too, so it's only fair. So, but just saying. And anyway, but one of my historian friends there, he's like, I don't think you should use the term, because it's a modern term. I said, no, it's not a modern term. 100 years ago, a lot of Christians self-identified and used the term fundamentalism, or in this case, as James Dunn uses it in the plural, because there's an acknowledgement of a lot of different varieties of fundamentalism. But hear me out for just a second, because I just want to unpack it and make sure it's very clear that, and so the question is, what is fundamentalism, right? And so I would suggest to you here tonight that, again, they would have self-defined the term fundamentalism as something, as sticking to the fundamentals of the Christian faith. You see, this is a time of extreme polarization, of militarization. World War I was taking place or soon thereafter. And so there was certainly a very militant need to defend the faith from various threats. Threats including Darwinism, evolution, modernism, modern critical thinking, historical critical approaches to the Bible that question whether God had even written the Bible. So these are the kinds of things that are being thought about, and people are wondering, if you don't believe the Bible's inspired, maybe you don't even believe that Jesus died as a savior for our sins. And they said, oh yeah, we're not sure about that either. at least for the modernists and liberals. And so you can start to see why the fundamentalists, as they call themselves, are saying, we better go back to the very basics of the Christian faith. We need to defend the Bible. We need to defend the historic tenets of Christianity. That is essential to what it means. And so the question is how did Adventists respond? We'll come back to that here in just a minute. Justo Gonzalez, rather prominent church historian, he talks about the intellectual challenges that were coming about in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he says modernity drastically changed the world view of most people in traditional Christendom. So again, how people are thinking, their world construct or worldview, as it's sometimes called, the world is ever changing, is it not? Even today, we would say, for a while, a long time, we said it was postmodernism. Now they're calling it metamodernism. That now we are in postmodernism, and so we have this constant flux of an evolving philosophy and how we see the world around us. And what are the things that are shaping and changing us? Technology, artificial intelligence, social media. I mean, these are having profound implications in how we live our lives, how we do religion, how we do politics in the world around us. And I think you might even admit with me that we live in a world where there's very extreme sound bites, and it seems that the people with the most crazy ideas and the most shrill voices are the ones that get heard because it gets all of the views and likes on social media. And so suddenly it sounds like the people that are the craziest suddenly are the most famous, and yet you question still how much influence they actually have. That's because the world continues to change. Our worldview around us is ever changing. But as he also points out, there are a number of ancient authorities, including the Bible, that was questioned as never before. And he adds that these new democratic ideals conflicted with the hierarchical structures of various churches. So people are asking, so what does this mean for the Christian church? How will this change and reshape Christianity? If you have people that are teaching evolution, does that mean you're still going to have people that want to be missionaries? What kind of churches? What will church actually look like? He goes on to say, Darwin and the theory of evolution became a symbol of the intellectual and doctrinal challenges of the time. So this is begging this question of how do Christians respond? Well, and respond they did. I began by explaining a little bit about the fundamentals and the response and the general ethos. But there's also a very specific historical document and moment where we see the coalescing of the historical fundamentalist movement within Christianity. And that's these little booklets called The Fundamentals. Don't you love that? I'm having a hard time seeing that back screen. My eyes, I can tell I'm getting older. I have to look at this screen now. So if I wander back here, it's because I'm recognizing that I'm changing. So, but I can still make those out on the back screen. The Fundamentals, there, those lovely pamphlets, and those were published by a group of conservative Christian thinkers and writers that began to put those things together, and they had the financial backing of the Standard Oil Company, the two founding brothers of that, who gave part of their oil fortune, their money, to be able to fund and print millions and millions of copies of those booklets so that any person that wanted to have a copy could easily do so. And so the Fundamentals become a rallying cry, a catalyst for this historical fundamentalist movement. Now, what's interesting is if you read those pamphlets, like I have, you will go through and look at those things, and you'll see that they're very concerned mostly about the inerrancy of the Bible, because if the modernists are saying that, well, maybe the Bible's not inspired, you can just pick and choose, they're going to say every last single word is inspired. So you're seeing a kind of a polarization taking place. And so they're saying, well, we don't know if God created the earth because of evolution. They're going to double down and say, of course God created this earth. And in fact, they will even go beyond the traditional understanding of saying God created it to saying, well, maybe that we can know even more specifically some of those details in our defense against evolution, right? So again, I'll come back to that a little bit later. A number of Adventists. Now, here's your question, your $1 million question. Were Adventists, did they see themselves as fundamentalists? Now, I'm going to leave these two out here. See, this is a review quiz from 2 years ago. Anybody that was here, did Adventists consider themselves fundamentalists? Some of you are shaking your heads. You were my A students because you were sitting right up here in the front. Yeah. Yes, of course they did. They saw themselves as the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists. They were the true believers that only Adventists could truly understand and appreciate the fundamentalist movement and have a true defense, because not only did they defend the creation, but they also kept the seventh-day Sabbath, because if most Christians that saw themselves as fundamentalists, they just hadn't gone far enough, and so they needed to go even farther in their literal understanding of Scripture. Well, a number of people are defending within Adventism this Adventist perspective of fundamentalism, and specifically a defense against evolution. George B. Thompson is the secretary of the General Conference. He attends the meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which ironically happened that year to be in Toronto, Canada. I think this is 1922. And he's observing that these scientists, they're just groping in the dark. All these theological seminaries, they're now teaching evolution. So he's seeing the Christian church not only under threat, but almost like an erosion of something that he considers to be core to the ethos and identity of Adventism and to Christian beliefs. And he says, I summarize the words here for time here, but to the effect here, it says, surely humanity didn't begin in zoological gardens, but was made in the image of God with a lineage reaching back to Adam. Now, people will start looking at that and saying, if really Adam was the first man, then I need to start going back and going through the chronologies. If I believe creation, then I need to not only believe in creation, but start looking for very literal chronologies that would help to date the beginning of creation. He goes on to say, we want strong young people who will come from our schools with a steadfast and unwavering faith in the Bible. For the sake of time, I'm just going to quickly move on. Calvin P. Bowman, who was the editor of Liberty or Religious Liberty publication, he writes this and says, the doctrine of evolution has been doing its deadly work. And faith in a personal God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, has been largely destroyed. So again, they're seeing the idea of evolution as part of the evolving fundamentalist saga, this movement within the broader Christian world, and within Adventism, we're seeing the same parallel kinds of concerns. Moffat, who is a Protestant fundamentalist, and he's quoted in the Watchman magazine. That's a Seventh-day Adventist publication. I like these words. I'm not going to read all of it because for the sake of time, wanted to make sure that I get to some of my main points later here. But I hope you catch a sense of the militancy, the need to not just choose to believe the true beliefs that they feel that they're having to hold on to, but to fight back. And there is this sort of sense, and that fundamentalism, the historical fundamentalist movement, that it's not just Christianity, but it's an angry variety of Christianity. So that then one must attack and destroy those who are threatening their faith. And I find this very interesting. He's quoted here, and he says, "The fight is on." He's not mincing any words, right? The fight is on. The issue is clearly drawn. And then he goes on between the different groups. He even describes them as irreconcilable. So there's no nuance, there's no middle ground. Everything is black and white. In fact, some scholars of fundamentalism, they describe this, that part of is not only theological, but there's sort of a philosophical, even a psychological element to the whole fundamentalist saga and its story, in that people are bifurcated. They can only see things in, again, black and white. No nuance, no middle ground, no compromise, no concessions, lest you give away the faith. Now, the question arises, okay, so Adventists are part and parcel within the historical fundamentalist movement. So what were Adventists teaching as the fundamentalist movement came to the fore? What were they teaching with regard to creation? Now, listen to this point very carefully, because if the fundamentalists were taking here are the errors, such as historical criticism and threats to creation, all these different things. They're taking that, and then they're going to the complete opposite, polarized, and they're taking that, and they're saying, well, not only is the Bible inspired, for example, but now that every single word is inerrant and infallible. Now, in Adventism, in our history, we've never officially accepted the idea that inspired writings are inerrant and infallible, as if somehow inspired writings came from a divine pipeline and filled the prophet and they just typed out word for word. In fact, if we believed that, we would have to reject Ellen White, because Ellen White certainly did not understand inspiration in that way. She talks about God's, in the Bible, she talks about God's penmen. The Bible writers, they were his penmen, but not his pen. She talks about them being inspired with their thoughts, and then they would use their own words to be able to write out and share the divine messages that God had given them. And anyone that knew Ellen White knows that during her lifetime, she had many different literary assistants. So God would give her dreams of the night and divine visions, and then she would write them out. And then she would have her literary assistants that could type up those things and make grammatical corrections. And then she would come back and revise them. And she would oftentimes do that many times. If she believed that every word was kind of like a divine pipeline, she certainly would not have needed to make any editorial corrections in that kind of process. You see the problem now here, right? And so she believed in a very flexible view of inspiration, that God inspired the whole person and allowed them through their experiences to the best of their ability to communicate those messages, right? And so now we're having the same problem with when it comes to creation. We had always affirmed that God had created human beings, but now we're going to see that some fundamentalists, including some Adventist fundamentalists, begin to head in some new and different kinds of directions. So let me introduce you to one of the most important of these individuals, George McCready Price. Well, I should probably tell you that he was born in Nova Scotia, so he's Canadian. And anybody that knows me, I'm Canadian too. So anyways, but that doesn't say anything here. But he grew up in a church worker's family and became very interested as a young person in the study of creation. In fact, he will work in several of our schools initially as a janitor. As he develops and has opportunities for more education, he'll seek those until he's able to eventually teach at a number of our different schools. What's interesting isn't so much his teaching, but his writings. He will become one of the most prolific authors that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has ever had, after maybe Ellen White. I mean, this guy I have in my basement full of books, our family library. 2 very large boxes, probably over 100 pounds of his books that I've collected over the years, and I know I haven't even collected all of them. So, it's just incredible how much he actually wrote. And he'll begin to posit some new, interesting ideas in order to what? Defend Adventist beliefs and fundamentalism from these kinds of threats. Now, his first book was published in 1902, titled Outlines of Modern Christianity and Modern Science. So he's dealing with this basic framework of how does the Christian church respond to modernity. And so he supposes one way to explain all of the unevenness in the geological record is there had to be a flood, a massive flood that took place and destroyed and upset many of the geological records as seen today. Now he begins to expand his views as he writes and continues to do his research. Obviously, he contrasts his perspective from that of evolution. He argues for a divine immanence as a basis for gaining an understanding beyond what he viewed as a limited scientific method. He wasn't very interested in any science that might contradict his research, let's put it that way, and raised questions about uniformitarianism. That's the idea that everything is the same, especially in the geological record, stemming from what he understood from biological evolution. Now, his most famous book was published 21 years later, titled The New Geology. Now, this is the book that will put Price on the map. I almost felt like saying that's The Price is Right, And Ronald Numbers wrote a book called The Creationist, where he does actually a really good job. I don't agree with all of his research, but in this case, he did a very good job, noting how the Genesis flood was the central geological event in the history of the earth. And so this pivot in his thinking came to be called the New Catastrophism, which stood in stark contrast to the aptly coined Old Catastrophism, I'm getting tongue-tied now, Catastrophism of the prior century, which meant largely that he is trying to explain and defend Adventist or a broader Protestant understanding of creation using the flood as the explanation for understanding science. And so if science doesn't make sense, the geological record doesn't make sense, it's simply because of the flood. That was the defining geological event in the history of the earth. Well, he'll go on to teach other things later on. I don't have time just this evening to go into. There are numerous scholarly articles that have been published about Price and his work, including by a number of non-Adventist scholars. His work is finally attracting quite a bit of more attention in recent years. And eventually he'll reflect back upon his work and his contributions. He'll see his work in alignment with, now this shouldn't be any surprise to you, the publication of the fundamentals, these same booklets. He sees himself as continuing the work of the fundamentalists and this genre of fundamentalist literature. By the way, in Adventist circles, his books will be advertised as fundamentalist literature, and then in fundamentalist publications, his books will be advertised there, except for they don't tell anybody that he's Adventist. And he becomes probably one of the best-selling authors our church has ever had. That people just were eating up all of his work. Now, Reuben Torrey and William B. Riley, both two of the most prominent fundamentalist leaders, authors of the 1920s and into the 1930s, they both extensively quote Price in their works fighting against the modernists. Now, this is a little bit ironic and probably a good reason why they didn't mention that he's Adventist when they were advertising his books, because Torrey and Riley hated Seventh-day Adventists. Now, that's a long and separate story by itself. Torrey, early on in his ministry, I found this out after doing quite a bit of research, he somehow, I think, was on a train with A.T. Jones of 1888 fame, if any of you recognize that. And A.T. Jones could be a very strong personality, and apparently they had an argument, kind of a feud, and the rest of his life he hated A.T. Jones and wanted nothing to do with Seventh-day Adventists. In fact, wrote several tracts attacking Adventism, and specifically he was going after Jones. He just hated A.T. Jones. Anyways, that's a story for another day. But as the issue of evolution was being popularized, now this is very interesting, William Jennings Bryan and others in the 1920s began to quote Price's works as well. And he becomes one of the most famous politicians. He's the man of the people, they said, and he runs for president a number of different times. And of course, there's his golden speech, his famous or infamous golden speech and everything else. And so he becomes one of the most prominent Christian politicians of the 19-teens and 20s. Very, very interesting person. Now, 1922, which is a year I happen to think is a very important year. Not least of which is Willa Cather says that's the year that the world divided in two, right? Of course, she's talking a little bit something broader, but it was a time of incredible polarization, a time of politics, of Christian nationalism, of racism. 1922 is the heyday of white supremacy in America. The Ku Klux Klan, the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, where they're having national marches talking about the importance of segregation and brutalizing people that don't look white. So white supremacy was at its height at this point in America. And this is probably not our finest, one of our fine points in American history. And it's uncomfortable because sometimes when we study history, we find things that not only that we like and we celebrate, but sometimes we find things that we find very uncomfortable too. And probably one of the most challenging things I've ever found in my research looking at Adventism and fundamentalism is that some of our Adventists were so fundamentalist, so in love with the fundamentalist movement, that some of the leaders of the fundamentalist movement, like J. Frank Norris, who is a very prominent white supremacist and very active in the Ku Klux Klan, Adventists said, well, if they're part of the Ku Klux Klan, we should too. Don't you think? And I wrote a whole long research paper and published an article on this, how we had a number of even church leaders, again, not everybody, but some Adventists found themselves very enamored with the Ku Klux Klan. Well, why would some Adventists like the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s? Well, they were for private Christian education. They were against the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't want government interference in their lives. These are the kinds of things. And Adventists said, we love it. You're our people. And sometimes the danger is when we become involved with popular Christian political movements and there's a fusion of faith and politics together, it can become incredibly toxic and dangerous. And this is what happened in our country, and specifically Adventism found itself struggling with 100 years ago. And so I think we need to pause and think about these things, because at the time people didn't realize what did this mean. Well, of course, aren't you part of the Ku Klux Klan? In fact, some Adventist church, I could tell you stories. It's not going to be very edifying for you. I'm going to move on. But if you really want to know, I wrote an article on this, and you can just look it up. Just Google my name and Ku Klux Klan, you'll find it. No affiliation, just no advertising. All right. But 1922, there is this famous conference on fundamentalism, and the convention, the World's Fundamentals Conference. This is the fundamentalists that I'm telling you about in the wider Christian, this historical movement that's taking place. This particular event takes place in Los Angeles, California, June 25 to July 2, 1922. And a lot of these different speakers. But at this convention, there was a very powerful politician who comes to the aid of the fundamentalists and says, if you vote for me, I will look out for your cause, and I will support your brand of Christianity. Now, I'm using my own words here, but to kind of very quickly synthesize a lot of historical material. But but you're welcome to look this up in one of my books. And they invite him to be the keynote speaker and talk. Again, William Jennings Bryan. Very interesting. And so he becomes the rallying politician of the fundamentalists, says, I will represent you, and is catering to them and their vote. And so he says, in fact, he learns that they, and he has almost like this conversion experience while he's there at this conference. And so he preaches, against all of these other things, and that we need to come back to the very Word of God. I mean, these ostensibly are good things, right? But you have to wonder at sometimes, both in history, when politicians begin to start pandering to people in order to get their votes. And the question is, did it work? Did it work? Are politicians sometimes very successful at luring Adventists? I'm not talking about today. Historically, of course. Long ago. I'm sure that would never be a problem today. But 100 years ago, that's why historians, we deal with 100 years ago. It's much safer to live in the past, right? And it did work. William Jennings Bryan is on more covers of Seventh-day Adventist church periodicals than any other person. Did you know that? Even today. Dozens and dozens of times, because Adventists saw him as their hero. In fact, it's amazing to me to think about this for just a minute, because William Jennings Bryan, the other person I really loved was Teddy Roosevelt. They actually have an article about the model Adventist young man. Like, if you really want to be a young man who is faithful to God and will be ready when Jesus returned, who is the epitome of the model man? Not Jesus, not James White or Martin Luther or any other famous person in our church history. It was Teddy Roosevelt himself. If everybody could be more virile like Teddy Roosevelt, or in this case, more like William Jennings Bryan, that then we could make Jesus come. Now, I'm not making this up. This is found in Adventist periodicals. I'm just a historian. I do research in the archives. I tell you what I find. Sometimes it makes me a little uncomfortable, but it's the truth. And that's what we're here tonight to look at, is to ask ourselves some of these kinds of hard questions. In fact, William Jennings Bryan, he knows his audience very well. In fact, Adventists were at that 1922 conference. They said, do you think you could come speak for us at our church headquarters and at Pacific Press and at these different Adventist institutions? And he wrote back and he said, of course, I love it, thank you. And so they were fawning over William Jennings Bryan, and he would become not only somebody extolled on the covers of periodicals, but one of our prominent speakers at denominational events. So we're beginning to see the impact of fundamentalism. We're seeing the impact of the mix of politics and religion when those are merged together. By the way, there's something very significant and sacred in our church history that we've always adhered to, the separation of church and state and religious liberty and these kinds of things. There's a reason why our church has always adhered to those beliefs, and it's vitally important that we do so today. Now, in the fact that I'm even bringing these things up, some of you are going to say, well, what are his political views? That's why I'm going to just be very candid with you. We as Seventh-day Adventists, I don't identify with either political party. I don't identify with either political candidate, because I'm headed to a better land. Now, I do make personal choices and decisions, but I do think it's really important that our faith informs our politics and not our politics informing our faith. And so I want you to just kind of think about that a little bit. I'm not here to, whatever your political leanings and viewpoints, is not to critique them here tonight, but I do hope that it gives all of us reason for pause and introspection to say, am I allowing truly my beliefs to challenge me and inform the way I see the world around me, including how I view the political landscape in the world in which I live? William Bell Riley, another very famous fundamentalist who's published widely in Adventist periodicals. He writes this very important article that's published in Adventist periodicals, and this is an example of it, The Gospel of Geology. Geology, in proving the geological record, is so important to disprove evolution that they're willing to go even farther than what most geologists would commonly accept, and they'll find very problematic and challenging soon afterwards, and I'll come back to that later. But they're so convinced they're right that they will accept even sometimes flawed data in order to prove or to disprove what they find to be disagreeable. So Adventists are continuing the push, and it's very interesting because this all comes to a head in 1925 in San Francisco in a series of debates between Maynard Shipley and the Adventist Francis D. Nichol, who is the editor of the Review, or today we call it the Adventist Review, or so on. And this will become the first of a series of creation and evolution debates across the United States that year. And almost some historians say that it was a dry run for what will become known later on as the Scopes trial. And so here's a picture of both of them when they were younger, about the time that this debate would have taken place. Of course, each of them claimed to have victory over the other, so you never know how debates are going to end. But it is interesting to me to see that they're beginning to hash these things out in a very political and public kind of way. Well, later on that year, of course, this will indeed take a very public forum and will catch national and international attention when a young school teacher in Tennessee, he later admitted that all he was just a body that was willing to be kind of the fall guy to get all of this publicity. In fact, in the city of Dayton, where the trial will take place, they were kind of egging him on. We need a volunteer. Who's willing to do this? We want our city to become famous. If we can just get somebody to be the fall guy, that will have national and international attention. And to this day, the city of Dayton, Tennessee, I think is even a little bit awestruck that it was attention to a point that they had never imagined was possible. I visited the museum. I know the museum director. The courthouse is now that historical museum of the Scopes trial. And this summer, interestingly enough, they had a whole reenactment of the infamous Scopes trial. So just because it's that famous in American history. And so the question is can you, are you allowed to teach? What are you allowed to use in the classroom? And there was a new Tennessee State Act that had prohibited teachers from propagating evolution in schools. And so he didn't really care, but he said, okay, if you say so. So he gets one of these banned textbooks or refuses, and of course he is found immediately guilty of teaching evolution after incriminating himself at trial. Really, the trial wasn't anything to do with John Scopes. It had everything to do with the capturing the public imagination, the attention. In fact, they said that this trial was so famous that there were more telegram words sent updating newspapers and other people around the world blow by blow through the whole trial than any had ever been telegraphed or communicated before up until this event in 1925. Here's a picture inside the courtroom, And as all of this is taking place, there's a number of really good books that have been written on the Scopes trial. So if you really get into this after tonight, I could give you a list of really fun books if you want blow by blow of every little detail. I've read quite a few of them now. And actually, I don't know, I kind of started doing a crazy deep dive on this because William Jennings Bryan and Darrow, who's the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, who's the defense lawyer, they both volunteered to do it pro bono. And two of the most famous individuals in America, lawyers at that particular time. And so I was so excited about this that I went down to the Library of Congress and the National Archives in the last 2 years. I've spent maybe 24 times going to downtown DC and reading through all of the unpublished papers and writings of both Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, because that's just what I like to do for fun. I mean, I know we all have different things we like to do for fun, and for me, just spending a day in the archives is immeasurably fun for me. And so we all have our vices, but anyway, so I did that, and my wife came with me too, so it was like a date too, right? So she went to the early modern European collection, and she did her thing, and I did my thing, and so we had fun. In fact, I showed you a book of Matthew Avery Sutton, and I was spending a couple hours one day, and I'd been researching, and I looked behind me and said, "Matthew, what are you doing here?" He says, "I'm looking at the Scopes papers too," and so it's fun how historians, how you bump into each other as you do research over the years and get to know other people who have the similar kinds of interests. Anyways, that's beside the point, but the legal case of the Scopes trial, or what is ignominiously referred to as the monkey trial, because of evolution having evolved from monkeys, right, will technically, Scopes will win the trial, and I think, or actually, I think he pays a small fine of $5 or $10. It's very nominal, but people say that really that William Jennings Bryan and the Christians who tried so hard to prosecute the case, they lost the case of popular opinion at the time, and so this is part of the challenge is that. How far do you push these kinds of things? And the other thing I found in the papers, and why I spent so much time in the Darrow and the Bryan papers, I was curious, do Adventists show up anywhere in the trial? And guess what? They do. I found quite a few references. In fact, guess who Bryan really loves to read? George McCready Price. In fact, he writes a letter, says, "Would you please come and be an expert witness for me at the Scopes trial?" And Price writes back and says, "Well, I don't have a travel budget, and our church was not sure if they really liked his books or not, so they sent him over to England." Usually that's a typical move if you're somewhat on the edge. You send them off to go be a missionary, okay? Good thing I didn't get introduced as having been a missionary, but anyways. but yeah, so he's off in England. And so he writes back, says, "I can't come back. I don't have any money to do that." And so Bryan is actually kind of disappointed. He said, you're the scientist that I've been looking for to help prove my case. So he reads his books and refers to his writings and keeps on an active correspondence with Price, which is absolutely fascinating that Adventists have this very interesting connection with the Scopes trial through George McCready Price. Anyways, moving on, Henry Fairfield Osborne says that today the earth speaks with resonance and clearness, and every ear in every civilized country of the world is attuned to its wonderful message of the creative evolution of man, except the ear of William Jennings Bryan. He alone remains stone deaf. He alone, by his own resounding voice, drowns the eternal speech of nature. In other words, in trying to prove their case, they tried to prove too much. And they proved beyond what the Bible actually taught, to the point where people said, well, then maybe the Bible doesn't have any credibility at all. And so Christianity, which had up until that point quite a bit of resonance and dominance, even in the political life of this country, people began to lose faith in the efficacy and the relevance of Christianity. They started seeing Christians and the fundamentalists specifically as being anti-intellectuals, as holding culture and society back from progress. And so that's why I say that they may have technically won the trial, but they lost in the court of public opinion, because the fundamentalist movement after that will really face a question of credibility, and it will disappear from the limelight of the popular imagination here in America. One last picture. This is Darrow, the leading defense, and here you have Bryan, the leading prosecutor here, and at one point there's this dialogue that takes place between them. He says, what do you think that the Bible itself says? Do you know how it was arrived at? And Bryan replies, he says, I never made a calculation. He says, what do you think? He says, I do not think about things I don't think about. So he says, do you think about things you do think about? And he says, sometimes. So you can see why, as those stories were being recorded, and that's in the trial minutes, why people began to lose faith in the fundamentalists. They began to question, do Christians really have any credible response to the teaching of evolution? This is one of the many, many newspaper headlines of that era, and you can kind of see a number of different historians have commented on this. Even John Scopes himself, who's the centerpiece of the trial, was forgotten. But he did say this afterwards, reflecting upon his experience towards the end of his life. He said, I believe that the Dayton trial, referring to his own trial, marked the beginning of the decline of fundamentalism. I feel that restrictive legislation on academic freedom is forever a thing of the past, that religion and science may now address one another in an atmosphere of mutual respect and a common quest for the truth. I like to think that the Dayton trial had some part in bringing to birth this new era. Fundamentalism goes underground. It's lost its credibility. This is the last one here. Of course, William Jennings Bryan will shortly after the trial tragically die, I think of a heart attack, as I recall off the top of my head. And so you see this incredible polarization. By the way, J. Frank Norris, I mentioned him earlier. He's one of the most prominent white supremacists as well as fundamentalists. He loves George McCready Price. He's the one that is urging again and again to, Brian, aren't you sure you can get some money, raise enough money to bring him over from England? We really need this guy. We need Price and these other fundamentalists if we're ever going to win our case and appeal to the American public. We need to find scientists who can prove what we need them to prove that we are right. Now, this is the danger of whenever somebody takes a position, isn't, as I mentioned before, on inspiration. Those are attacking the Bible and then going to inerrancy and infallibility, defending creation or evolution, the attacks of evolution, that some people would, instead of just saying that God created this earth or God created us, that began to prove more than what the Bible or Ellen White had originally intended. And so Price will begin to make increasingly more grandiose claims, and this will be part of a challenge. And he starts even using Ellen White's writings. In fact, he goes to the statements of Ellen White on amalgamation. Maybe you've heard of them before, the amalgamation of man and beast, and which has always been very controversial. Ellen White penned those statements in 1864, right at the end of the American Civil War, detailing how the animals of Noah's Ark were to be preserved over their relatives, and she describes confused species, which were the result of amalgamation. Well, this is very interesting because now Price is arguing and says, well, if Ellen White said that, then she must be talking about the amalgamation, not of just animals, but of human beings. And remember, this is the era of white supremacy. And so then, therefore, the only way to explain the different races and the different colors of different races on earth is through using these amalgamation statements. And at one point, he'll even go farther than that to claim even demonic manipulation as a reason for this eventual diversification of species. Now, this is problematic because we're now using Ellen White's writings in a way that is becoming incredibly, makes me uncomfortable, and we would probably look back at and say is very racist and very problematic. Interestingly enough, Price's ideas will become popularized in the 1961 publication by Whitcomb and Morris, who will largely crib from George McCready Price, and his ideas live on in the wider fundamentalist movement through others who have taken his work and used it, oftentimes without giving him proper credit, but his ideas continue to live on. I hope you're seeing that part of the challenge of fundamentalism, in this case dealing with creation, is people begin to take that, but then they're using even more extreme views. Another example of this is using the chronologist Ussher's chronology of 6,000 years to try to prove that there was an exact date when the creation actually occurred. So, and again, I could go into a lengthy treatment on just that. Maybe if we have a little time in the Q&A, I can respond or comment on that a little bit more. But you begin to see. Now, to Price's credit, this is him at the end of his life with one of his most favorite students, Dr. Marsh, who will continue his legacy on, writing many other books. And he challenged Price. Towards the end of his life, he said, you know, I think you were wrong. I think you were wrong. There is overwhelming scientific evidence that the young earth creationism that he had advocated for earlier in his life, that he didn't make accounts for these different kinds of scientific research and different problems in the flood layers. And to Price's credit, he was willing to admit at the end of his life that he had made some mistakes. He had claimed too much. Now, again, for the sake of time this evening, I don't have time to go into all the little nuances. We could get lost in some very arcane and very detailed debates about these kinds of things, but to his credit, he was willing to say and acknowledge that he had claimed too much. And this raises broader questions for Adventism today. You know, how do we relate to science and religion or faith? You know, and when there are challenges between the two, how do we make sense of that world? Well, one of the things I think we have to do is constantly have a sense of humility, that we don't claim more than what the Bible actually claims, right? This is the danger of the fundamentalists, that we want to protect our faith so much that we go and claim and prove too much. Another aspect of that, and I think Leonard Brand, I don't know if he was still there when you were at Loma Linda, very beloved professor at Loma Linda, good friend. He used to always sit in front of my wife and I at church when we were at Loma Linda years ago, so just really a very dear person. He argued that one who accepts the Bible as a reliable record of events is not hampered by that worldview, as many would claim, but actually has an advantage, because most scientists are only familiar with one basic understanding of Earth history and do not actively ask critical questions of their paradigm. See, part of good Christian biblical thinking is we can not have to feel threatened, and in order to protect our faith, we have to react constantly to anything that threatens our faith, but rather that we can, with a solid foundation, be able to look at the questions around us and even the things that we don't have answers to. And maybe we may not have answers to every single question that we have, but we can still have faith in God's Word and the fact that He created us, and still be careful, again, as I mentioned before, not to claim too much. And wrapping up tonight, I want to leave you with a couple of observations and thoughts, and then if we have time, maybe just a question or two. But first of all, Adventists have from the earliest beginnings recognized the importance of God's divine creation as recorded in Genesis. This was an important basis for the Seventh-day Sabbath and Adventist theology. We've always valued the creation story as a story that gives meaning to our theology and our faith. Yet with fundamentalist Adventism, if you please, or however you want to put that, that version of fundamentalist Adventism in the 1920s, I should say, was pushed to make increasingly more extreme positions about a literal creation, pushing Adventism away from its earlier forebears to reflect the wider fundamentalist movement. Which leads me to one of the ways is that Christian nationalism, right? And fundamentalism, they combine together into a dangerous combination, kind of a toxic brew, if you please, that made it difficult to separate one's Christianity from their politics. This was true of Adventism in the 1920s and pushed Adventism into some very uncomfortable directions that we look back at. Yet at times, the desire to support increasingly rigid positions led individuals like Price to take extreme positions, such as amalgamation, reflecting these racist sensibilities of that time. Yet Price made a profound impact I didn't have time to prove this point and show it to you, but I think hopefully I've made it at least enough of a case that you can see through the Scopes trial with William Jennings Bryan, J. Frank Norris, who deeply loved and admired his writings and used his writings. You can get at least a little bit of a taste of just how much of an impact through Price Adventism had upon the wider Scopes trial and the wider fundamentalist movement. This impact hasn't been widely known or recognized. Therefore, for his part, Price later moved away, and to his credit, acknowledged that some of his own earlier positions, some of these extreme positions he had taken, when he found later scientific evidence that challenged his positions, was willing to concede and change those positions, which I think should all give us a point of humility, that we should be always careful not to claim too much. Well, thank you very much and for listening tonight. And I don't know if we have a couple of questions, but we'd be happy to entertain anything that I could help, hopefully, try to clarify for you tonight.
Do you have a copy of the 1925 debate?
I do, but
Good.
Yeah. But if you have a really nice copy, I would love to have a picture of it, because I might use it in my next book.
I think I have two of them, but one of them belonged to my great-grandfather, and I'm not giving it up.
No, but bring it, and I'll just take a picture of the cover.
Oh, you want a picture of the cover? You want me to bring it in?
Yeah, could you?
Okay.
Just a picture. Because if your picture looks nicer and you give me permission, I'll use it in my next book.
Probably several questions, but I won't ask them all. One point of information: there's a radio televangelist. I always get his name confused. The name comes to mind, Chuck Tunstall or something like that. Anyway, he was talking about the flood one day, and it was like he was reading out of Patriarchs and Prophets. Mm-hmm. He talks about, he was describing the flood and how great rocks were ejected up into the air, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So I emailed them and said, where does he get his information? And I think, I'm going to guess, the names were Whitcomb and Morris.
Oh,
anyway,
sure.
There were some contemporary people, mm-hmm. and so I looked them up. And somehow, and they were getting, it mentioned in the article that they got their stuff from George McKinney Price, which I thought was interesting. Now back to the emphasis on William Jennings Bryan in the 20s, our sure. Adventist publications. There was also very supportive in Adventist publications of William G. Harding.
Oh, yes.
In the 20s.
Yeah, because his family was Adventist.
Right, and so forth. I'm wondering, was there some kind of a fascination with trying to somehow feel we could get approval from public sources, the government, or a recognition? Was there?
I think that's always a danger. To answer that one specific question, there's always a danger of wanting to have political power and public approval, right? Just to give you an example, I lived in another country in Asia for a number of years, and the president changed, and the new president came in under a thing that he was going to clean up corruption and kill or to get rid of any drug lords, and suddenly all his political opponents were all drug lords. And so all the people that were being massacred and killed were just happened to conveniently all be in the opposite political party. And so this was very disconcerting. It felt very destabilizing. It didn't feel very safe to be in that country at that point. And I'll never forget one time he said that if people didn't do what he wanted, that the Catholic bishop, if the Catholic bishop or archbishop didn't do what he wanted, he was going to convert and become a Seventh-day Adventist. And I remember having many friends say, wow, this is such good news. The president of our country is going to become an Adventist. And I thought to myself, but he doesn't have any interest in Christianity, has no interest in any Adventist beliefs, but the allure or the elixir of potential political power and prestige of having the president be in one's own political party, even if their own, in this case, that person was well known for swearing, very, very profane words. Almost a sentence didn't go by and he didn't without using a profanity, okay? And I remember thinking, this person is the most opposite person of a Christian, kills his political opponents, everything else, and yet then suddenly all these Adventists were fawning over him saying, oh, I can't wait for him to become Adventist. And I kept thinking, I can't wait for him to be converted to Jesus Christ. And so we shouldn't want political power and prestige more than we want someone to know Jesus Christ. And that wasn't true of all people from that particular part of the world, but it did fascinate me that how easy it was to live in a country and find people that were very, very allured by the potential for political power and prestige. And that's always been a danger that Christians have faced throughout church history.
I guess my question would be, in your research, have you found that this allure was strong by church leaders in the 20s, and that's why you
Oh, absolutely. That's why I'm mentioning it, because the potential for political power and prestige was very, 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 very tempting and difficult to resist. And this is something that we should always ask ourselves at all times, or, when it comes to our politics and these different kinds of things, are we, why are we attracted to things that we are attracted to? Yeah.
I had a question. It seems this challenge that the people in the 20s had is almost an eternal challenge for humans, Christians, right? You look around the world, there's something that you're not happy with, and do you engage with it, or do you just stick to yourself and let it unfold? In the modern church, it seems there's no shortage of issues that certain Christians feel like they need to get out in front of and confront the world on. And it also, at the same time, it seems like there's tons of issues that Christians are unhappy that fellow Christians have, and they kind of want to publicly confront their fellow Christians to portray a different, perspective on the church to the secular world. And so these 20s events, they're a great example of, someone trying to step out, make a difference, you might say, in the world, and perhaps not succeeding in achieving their goal. Can you think of any off the top of your head examples in the studies of history that you've had where Christians have, as a critical mass of people, stepped out and made some sort of intended positive impact through engaging the secular culture?
Oh, absolutely. So I think probably in terms of being countercultural, if I'm hearing you right, I look back to our earliest pioneers like Joseph Bates and William Miller and even James and Ellen White, that they were part of a world, an ethos of activism, where they said, okay, Jesus is coming again soon, which means that if we really believe Jesus is coming again soon, that also means that we don't endorse slavery of any way, shape, or form. And so all of our pioneers, almost very uniformly, were abolitionists, fighting against not only preaching about Jesus coming, but they're part of the Underground Railroad networks. They're part of doing active work to try to defeat slavery. And so when you look at that, fighting against slavery, fighting against alcohol consumption, many of our pioneers, Ellen White was probably, at one point, she was more famous outside of Adventism as a temperance lecturer. And again, was invited to speak at major events because of her passion against alcohol. So there are some really good examples of both in Adventist history of where Adventists were countercultural, and yet there's other examples where maybe at times we failed on the job too. So we learn from the times when we failed, and then we extol those moments where we can say, okay, wow, they were abolitionists, they're fighting against slavery, they're doing all the things that we champion and say, wow, that's the best of Adventism. And so there's plenty of good examples of Christianity being countercultural, but if we are so in love with the political environment in which we live, in that milieu, and we can't separate ourselves from it, we're going to miss when God calls us to be countercultural in our own time and place.
Last question.
You mentioned that Price kind of changed or stipulated that he'd maybe overemphasized some things and so forth.
Yeah.
Were these mere details, or did they really make a significant difference in his ideology?
He thought it was pretty significant, his ideology, in terms of having to modify how he understood, for example, some of the flood creation narratives and things like that. Again, I had to kind of gloss over it very quickly, and this is not meant to be a shameless plug, but I have a book coming out, A Global History of Seventh-day Adventists. I have a whole chapter and a very lengthy treatment of George McCready Price, of his ideas, and then also at the end of his life, some of his changes in those ideas. So I feel bad because I've had to gloss over that a little bit, but I'd be happy to talk with you more about it. So thank you very much. God bless, and look forward to spending some more time with you tomorrow. I will be here, and so if I didn't get to answer your question, would love to talk with you one-on-one, and we'll have some more great, well, I guess we have church tomorrow morning, and then we have a program in the afternoon. So go in God's grace and peace. And do you want to say anything?
There are refreshments out in the foyer, and we'll meet back here in the sanctuary tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Have a good night.